one of the things that I feel like people, they take and they deify the people so much that they're no longer human. And we have the people, the pictures of the saints walking around with the halos upon their heads. And you've removed that. You've removed it and you've made it everyday people. What was the biggest challenge to be able to do that? I mean, making Matthew autistic. I mean, that was like, okay. And watching it when I first broke out, I went, I think he's autistic. And seeing how the guys, even the way they talk to him, because they don't know the diagnosis, you know, of course, we're taking 21st century things and we're importing it back in the first century. So how did you guys really wrestle with how to have these people deal or struggle with those things? And even going to the point of having Mary relapse, which I find to be refreshing, because I think most people think delivered, done. And it's like, no, you have to take up your cross daily. This is the Romans 7, die to oneself. And because we all struggle, I do the things I don't want to do, and the things I don't want to do, this I do. And you guys are bringing that out. But what was the thought process in creating the complexity of each of those characters to draw people in?
Well, I have done a lot of study and research on the brain. I became a much better filmmaker, actually, when I started researching psychology and leadership and communication. When I have a family, I mean, I have autism in my family. It's something I'm extremely familiar with. And as soon as it came into my family, I started researching it extensively. And when I started doing that, I became a nerd on the brain and on personality and communication and all that. So that, from a specific standpoint, when we first started developing the show and developing who our main characters were going to be, we do what's called a character profile. And so you go, all right, Matthew, we know he's going to be one of our main characters. Let's write him up on the wall. Simon Peter, going to be one of our main characters. We start writing down everything that we know about them from scripture, because that's where we start. And then you start bringing in history and culture and what would be some of the things about history and culture that would impact these people that we don't know from scripture. You're a preacher. You every sermon you do, you start with scripture, but then you, of course, go extra biblical and you give context. And you say, here's what would have been happening at this time. Here's what, you know, those things aren't in scripture. So there's that. And then at the end of the day, it ultimately comes down to understanding human psychology and the brain and how it works. And you go, okay, so based on Matthew, what can we extrapolate? Because we're going to be spending 7 seasons with this guy, and we can't just cover the 10 verses that talk about things he said or done. We need to expand. So you start writing and you go, okay, he was a tax collector, so he's a numbers guy, good with numbers. He's a facts guy. The first chapter of his book is nothing but a genealogy. And it's split into 3 sections of 14 apiece, like equal. So he's a facts guy, and he's very ordered. Then he chose a profession that made him an outcast, hated by the Jews, disrespected by the Romans. Wow, that's interesting. And I started to go, that fits into like a lot of people with Asperger's or autism that I know. You know, they're comfortable being social outcasts because they're not great with people anyway. So, you know, there's exceptions, of course, but it doesn't come naturally to them. And numbers driven, facts driven, ordered, you know, wow. Okay. What if we made Matthew autistic? That would be an amazing way to humanize the show and humanize his character and draw him in. And then you do the same thing with Simon Peter. Okay. We know that he's temperamental. We know he's a leader. We know he's, aggressive, violent, but also loyal. And so you start writing all that, and then you start going, all right, well, what does that look like in a marriage? What does that look like when he's struggling financially, when he's being so heavily taxed that he can barely survive? What would he do? What would his desperation look like? And that brings me to where things can get controversial is like in episode 5, there were 3 things that really stood out as controversial. Number 1, Mary Magdalene, number 1 was Jesus' sermon prep. Number 2, Mary Magdalene relapsing. And number 3, John the Baptist. There's a scene between John the Baptist and Jesus where they argue or I wouldn't call it arguing, maybe bickering a little bit as kind of cousins, you know, just kind of bantering back and forth. And there are some people who lost their minds, just like John would never question Jesus. Jesus would never challenge John on something he's doing. John was Jesus even said John was the greatest, you know, of all of the, you know, outside of Jesus, John the Baptist was the greatest of all. And I'm always like, well, yeah, but he said that right after John had questioned from prison whether Jesus was actually the Messiah. John had spent time with Jesus. John had called Jesus. John had baptized Jesus. Another time, by the way, John argued with Jesus was when he baptized him. And so in the very few verses we have about John the Baptist, we've seen him argue with Jesus or be questioning or frustrated, whatever term you want to use, about Jesus twice in the limited number of times we see him. So is it plausible? That's our operating question. Is it plausible? Is it plausible that when Jesus and John have a sit down to kind of state of the union about their ministries, that John would be like, dude, why aren't you doing more? Like, why aren't you attacking, the kings and the more often than you are? Why do you sometimes, tell people to not reveal that you're the Messiah? Why haven't you started yet? What's going on? Like, that's how, and in fact, there were two Messianic Jewish elders who watched that scene and were like totally in love with it, because they're like, yes, this is how Jews talk. We bicker, especially in the family. Like, in the family, it's like you sit around the table and that's your love language. It's like Italian. We're going to push each other. And then at the end of the scene, John says, look, I was rude to you, but that's because I can tease a bit. We can do all this. But for the record, my heart is yours. My life is yours. The whole reason I was conceived by two old people was to prepare their way for you. I'm just eager for you to get to work, And so you can make these assessments, what I believe are plausible, based on your understanding of human behavior, based on the little clues that you get from scripture. And you can create characters and human beings that look a lot like who we are. And that's what I believe is the secret sauce of the show. The thing that draws people most to the show is the humanity and the authenticity. And it also happens to be the thing that repels some people the most, is they go, wait a minute, that's my hero, and I can't see my hero struggle. And I understand that. But I come from the place, I'm an evangelical Baptist background.
Yep.
We are a group of people who are like, I don't want to call it self-loathing, but it's like we are the Ephesians 2:8-9 crowd. Like, it is by grace you are saved through faith, not of works, lest any man should boast. The Romans, all have sinned and come short of the glory of God. There is none righteous, no, not one. Those are the verses that are plastered on evangelical walls, at least most. And so this show is a show that's going to reveal all of our heroes, except for Jesus, sinning on a semi-regular basis. And Jesus as a human being who also happens to be God. And what that looked like, I don't know that anyone really knows, and certainly not the commenters on YouTube. So it'll all be, we'll all be kind of finding this together, but I believe ultimately presenting a portrayal of the Gospels that I think honors them.